The whole city seemed to glow for us. Banners with our names fluttered in the warm evening breeze. People I'd never met raised glasses in our honor, smiling as if they knew our love. Everywhere I turned, there were lights, music, and laughter, proof, at least to them, that we were the perfect couple. But they didn't see what happened when the cameras stopped flashing. They didn't hear the silence in our apartment at night. They didn't notice the way her hand slipped from mine the moment no one was watching. To them, she was my stunning, successful fiancée, a woman who had given me the kind of love story people dream about. To me, she was still my boss, cold, untouchable, and sometimes I wondered if she ever really belonged to me at all. The city had never felt so alive, as if every street lamp, every window, and every stranger's smile existed just for us. Our faces were on billboards downtown, framed in gold with a headline about the wedding of the year. Coffee shop chatter was filled with our names, and every shop window seemed to carry something white, gold, or sparkling. People congratulated me in the streets, as if I were a character in some beautiful story they had all been reading. In their eyes, I was the luckiest woman alive, about to marry a woman they admired and envied in equal measure. They saw her as perfect, sharp, elegant, impossibly composed. To them, she was the definition of success, and the fact that she had chosen me was something to celebrate. I played my part well. I smiled when they stopped us for photos, I laughed at the right moments, and I let her hand rest in mine for the flash of the camera. It was easy to make it look like we were deeply in love, because on the surface, it was almost believable. But the truth was quieter. The truth lived in the small, unglamorous moments that nobody else saw. The truth was that the moment the photographers stepped back, her fingers slipped from mine like they had somewhere else they belonged. In the car rides home from these public appearances, the silence stretched longer than the roads, filled only with the hum of the engine and the faint sound of the city outside. She would check her phone, her face lit by its glow instead of by my presence, and I would stare out the window pretending not to notice. In those moments, I didn't feel like her fiancé. I didn't even feel like her friend. I felt like her employee, sitting beside her because she had decided I belonged there, not because she wanted me there. I often thought about the first time I met her, long before there was talk of rings and gowns and citywide celebrations. It had been in her office, an intimidating glass-walled space with a view that seemed to look down on the entire city. I was there for an interview, nervous enough to feel the sweat on my palms, my heart pounding against my ribs. She was everything a person in her position should be: calm, deliberate, impossible to read. But somewhere between her first question and my final answer, her gaze softened. For just a second, I caught something unexpected in her eyes, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I left the building that day certain I would take the job if she offered it, not just because it was a step forward in my career, but because I was already drawn to her. Back then, I didn't know what that softness meant. I told myself it was a sign, proof that there was more to her than the icy image she carried. I clung to it in the months that followed, even when she hid it behind sharp words and formal instructions. It became a kind of compass for me, a private belief that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, she might show that side of herself again. Now, years later, as we stood side by side in front of the city that adored us, I couldn't stop wondering if I had imagined it all along. The weight of her hand in mine felt staged, an accessory for the cameras. Her smile was perfect, but it was the same one she wore at corporate dinners and press conferences, polished, safe, and not meant for me alone. The cheering crowd didn't know that when we got home, she would step out of her shoes, hang up her coat, and disappear into her office while I changed into something comfortable and waited for a conversation that would never come. And yet, despite the ache in my chest, despite the quiet nights and the coldness that had become part of our daily life, I still loved her. I loved her in the way people love storms from far away, dangerous and beautiful, impossible to touch without getting hurt. I told myself the woman I saw that day in her office, the one with the softer eyes, still existed somewhere behind the wall she built. Maybe she was buried under years of control, pain, and habits she didn't know how to break. Maybe she was gone. But I wasn't ready to give up on her, not yet. So I smiled for the city. I laughed when she said something charming for the microphones. I let my hand rest in hers and tried not to think about the way she would let go as soon as the cameras turned away. Because even if the truth was lonelier than anyone knew, I still wanted to believe that one day she might hold on when no one was watching. I still remember the first weeks after I joined the company, how everything felt too big for me, how the elevators moved so fast it made my ears pop, how the office smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive perfume, and how she always seemed to move through the hallways as if the whole building was hers, which, in a way, it was. She wasn't just my boss, she was the kind of woman you noticed before you even saw her face. Her presence carried first, her energy filling the space, and by the time you looked up, you were already aware of her. I kept my head down in those days, careful not to draw the wrong kind of attention. I was young, still learning, desperate to prove I belonged. She spoke to me only when necessary, her tone professional, her words clipped. But then there were these moments, small, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when her voice softened. Once, late in the evening when most of the office had emptied out, she walked past my desk and stopped. She looked at the spreadsheet I was working on and told me, quietly, "You're thorough." I like that. It was the kind of compliment most people would forget by the next morning, but it stayed with me. It was the first time she'd spoken to me without that cool, managerial tone. And in the days after, I found myself listening for it again, wondering if I might catch her off guard and hear that softness one more time. I began to notice little things about her, how she tapped her pen against the desk when she was thinking, how she always chose the chair near the window in meeting rooms so she could glance at the skyline between conversations, how her smile in public was flawless but her real one, the one she gave when she found something genuinely funny, was rare and almost shy. I told myself I was just paying attention because I admired her as a leader, but deep down, I knew it was more. Every time she let her guard down, even for a second, it felt like I'd been given something precious. There was one night, maybe 2 months after I started, when the air in the office was heavy with rain, the kind that makes the city lights blur through the windows. Everyone else had gone home early, and I was still at my desk trying to finish a report. I heard her voice behind me, asking why I was still there. I turned to see her leaning against the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. It was strange, seeing her there without the usual shield of authority in her posture. We talked for a few minutes, about the report, about the weather, about nothing in particular. But then she said something that caught me completely off guard: "Don't let this place eat you alive." It wasn't advice she would give in a meeting. It felt personal, almost protective. And for a moment, I thought I saw in her eyes a trace of loneliness, as if she knew exactly what it felt like to give everything to this company and have nothing left for herself at the end of the day. That was when I realized her distance wasn't just about control. It was also about survival. She had been hurt before, by people, by trust, by giving too much of herself away. I didn't know the details, but I could feel it in the way she kept everyone at arm's length, never letting them get too close. And that was the thing that hooked me. I wanted to be the one she let close. I wanted to be the exception. Over the months, there were other moments like that. Once, after a long day, we stayed late in the office to meet a deadline, and she ordered takeout for both of us. We ate together in her office, sitting on opposite sides of her desk, and for that 1 hour, she wasn't my boss, she was just a woman who liked her noodles spicy and her tea without sugar. She asked me about my family, and I told her stories about growing up, about the small apartment I shared with my sister, about how I always thought I'd end up somewhere quieter than this city. She listened, really listened, and when she talked about herself, she was vague but careful, revealing only fragments. I didn't push for more. I just wanted her to keep talking. But it was always the same cycle. She would show me this softer side, and then, the next morning, it would be gone, replaced by her usual cool professionalism. It was like chasing something in the fog. One moment it's right there, close enough to touch, and the next, it's vanished. Still, I told myself it was worth it. If I stayed close, if I proved my loyalty, maybe she would trust me enough to let that side of her stay. What I didn't realize then was that these small moments, these crumbs of warmth, were the foundation for everything that came later, every late-night conversation, every stolen look, every kiss we shouldn't have shared. Long before she was my fiancé, long before the city started celebrating us, she was the woman who made me believe that love could hide behind cold eyes, waiting for the right person to find it. And I wanted, more than anything, to be that person. The city seemed to hum with anticipation as our wedding drew closer, and everywhere I went, I felt the weight of other people's excitement pressing against me. Strangers on the street stopped to wish me happiness, vendors handed me flowers with warm smiles, and the local paper printed yet another flattering article about us, this time calling our story a union of love and power. They wrote as if they knew us, as if they had seen what we were like behind closed doors. And maybe that was the strangest part, how everyone seemed convinced that what we had was a kind of rare, enviable love. In public, I made sure they saw exactly what they wanted to see. I held her hand, I laughed at her dry jokes, I rested my head lightly against her shoulder when photographers asked for a shot. She was immaculate as always, with her hair perfectly styled and her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had built her life on control. The image we gave to the world was flawless, and sometimes even I almost believed it. But the truth was, our life away from all the lights and lenses felt like an entirely different story. At home, the energy between us shifted in ways no one else could imagine. There was no cruelty in her silence, no raised voice or sharp words, just a quiet distance that felt colder than any argument could. She spoke to me in short, polite sentences, like I was still the employee who had once stood nervously in her office taking notes. Sometimes, when we sat together on the couch, she would scroll through her emails, her face lit by the glow of her phone, and I would sit beside her pretending to watch the television but actually just listening for her voice, hoping she would say something, anything, that made me feel like I was hers. I tried to start conversations, about the wedding, about the honeymoon, about the places we could go or the traditions we could make, but she would give small, distracted answers, her mind somewhere else entirely. I told myself she was just busy, that the pressure of work and the looming wedding had her preoccupied, but deep down, I felt the ache of being in love with someone who seemed to exist on the other side of an invisible wall. Yet, there were moments, small, fleeting, but enough to keep me hoping, when she let that wall crack just a little. Late at night, when the world outside our windows was quiet, I would sometimes feel her hand brush mine under the covers. Once, after a long day, I found her in the kitchen with her hair down and her heels kicked off, pouring herself a glass of wine. She looked up, met my eyes, and for a second, I saw the same softness I had glimpsed years ago in her office. She asked if I wanted a glass, and we stood there in the kitchen sipping in silence, but the air between us was warm, not cold. It was enough to make me believe there was still something under all her guarded layers. I started holding on to these moments like they were rare gemstones, precious, beautiful, and far too scarce. I told myself that when the wedding was over, when the pressure was gone and it was just the two of us, maybe she would let herself relax into what we had. Maybe she would remember that I wasn't just someone to stand beside her at events, but the woman she had chosen to marry. Still, the closer the big day came, the more I noticed how much of her focus was on the optics of it all, the guest list, the seating arrangements, the press coverage, the designers she wanted to work with. It wasn't that she didn't care about the marriage, it was that she seemed to care more about the image of the marriage than the connection between us. There were nights when I lay awake beside her, listening to her even breathing, and wondered if she had ever felt the kind of pull toward me that I felt toward her. I wondered if our love was something she held in her heart or something she carried like a brand, another piece of her curated life. And yet, I couldn't imagine walking away. I had loved her too long, wanted her too deeply. I had convinced myself that beneath the frost, she was capable of a warmth that would melt everything if only she chose to give it. The city could keep celebrating our love story, because I still believed that somewhere within the private version of us, the one no one else could see, there was a story worth celebrating too. It had been one of those long winter nights when the city outside the windows was nothing but a smear of dark glass and scattered lights. Most of the office had emptied hours ago, leaving the quiet kind of stillness that only comes when the hum of conversation and footsteps disappears. I was still at my desk, half from dedication and half because I had convinced myself that staying late might somehow bring me closer to her. She had been in her office all evening, the glow from her desk lamp the only sign of life on that side of the floor. I told myself she was too busy to notice me, but then, just as I was considering packing up, she stepped into the open space with 2 glasses in her hand and a bottle of wine balanced against her hip. She didn't ask if I wanted to join her. She just tilted her head toward her office and said, "Come on. Let's take a break." I followed her inside, feeling strangely out of place even though I'd been there countless times before. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, warm and sharp at the same time, and the soft light from the lamp made everything seem more intimate than it should have been. She poured the wine into the glasses, sliding one across the desk toward me, then sat back in her chair with a tired sigh. "I don't usually drink in the office," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "but tonight's been long." Her voice had lost the crisp edge she used during the day. It was slower, quieter, as if each word had been pulled from somewhere deeper. We talked about work at first, deadlines, clients, the kind of problems that felt endless in the moment but would vanish in a few weeks. Then the conversation shifted without warning, as if the wine had loosened something in both of us. She told me about her childhood in pieces, never quite finishing one thought before moving on to another. She spoke about the first apartment she'd ever lived in on her own, about how she had learned to rely on no one but herself, about the fear that came with building a life where you couldn't afford to make mistakes. I listened, my glass untouched in front of me, because the sound of her voice when she let herself be vulnerable was something I didn't want to interrupt. Somewhere in the middle of it, she fell silent and just looked at me for a long moment. It wasn't the kind of look that asked a question or demanded an answer, it was something quieter, more searching. I felt my breath catch, because in her eyes I saw that same softness I had clung to since my first day here. It was there, unguarded, without the armor she always wore. Before I could think too much about it, she leaned forward and brushed her fingers against mine on the desk. It was a small gesture, but it sent a current through me, and when she finally closed the space between us, her lips were warm and hesitant against mine. The kiss was not the kind of firework explosion I had imagined in my head, it was slower, almost fragile, like she was testing how much of herself she could give away without losing control. We didn't speak for a while after that. We just sat there, the quiet between us heavy but not uncomfortable. She reached for her glass again, and I watched her, watched the way she turned the stem between her fingers, watched how her shoulders seemed less tense than usual. It felt like we had stepped into some secret place, a version of our world where we didn't have to be boss and employee, where the rules we lived by during the day didn't exist. I thought, foolishly, that this was the beginning of something real, but the next morning proved me wrong. When I walked into the office, she was already at her desk, her posture sharp, her voice cool as she went over the day's tasks. There was no mention of the night before, no flicker of recognition when our eyes met. For the rest of the day, she spoke to me the way she always had, professional, precise, and just distant enough to make me wonder if I had imagined it all. I told myself she was protecting us, protecting herself, that she didn't want anyone to know, but a part of me also feared that maybe it hadn't meant as much to her as it had to me. Still, I couldn't forget it. That night became something I replayed over and over in my mind, the sound of her voice, the weight of her hand on mine, the look in her eyes before she kissed me. It became the proof I needed to keep chasing whatever was buried beneath her coldness. Even if she built her walls higher the next day, I knew there was a door somewhere, and I had seen it open once. That was enough to make me believe it could open again. The weeks before the wedding became a blur of deadlines, fittings, and appearances, but somewhere in that blur, I found myself working harder than ever to close the distance between us. I planned quiet dinners at home, tried cooking her favorite meals even after long workdays, and left little handwritten notes on her desk, short lines reminding her that I loved her, that I was proud of her, that I couldn't wait to spend forever together. She never ignored them exactly, but her responses were small and contained, a faint smile, a brief thank you, a kiss on the cheek before moving on to whatever task was in front of her. I told myself it was just the stress of the wedding and her workload pulling her away from me, that once the chaos was over, we would settle into a rhythm that felt warmer. But the truth was that the gap between us was growing, and no matter how much I reached for her, she seemed to slip further back into the safety of her walls. There was a night, about 2 weeks before the ceremony, when we attended a high-profile dinner hosted by one of her longtime business partners. The room was filled with people dressed in sleek suits and shimmering gowns, the kind of crowd that moved through conversations like a dance. From the moment we walked in, she played the role flawlessly, her hand in mine, her voice warm and rich as she introduced me to people I'd never met, her laugh so convincing that I caught myself wondering if it was real. She called me her better half more than once, complimented me in front of the table, and even tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear in a way that felt intimate to everyone watching. I tried to let myself enjoy it, to believe it was more than performance, but deep down, I recognized the pattern. This was her public self, the charming, magnetic woman everyone admired. When we finally got home that night, I waited for her to carry some of that warmth through the door with us. I wanted her to drop the performance and keep holding me, keep looking at me like I mattered beyond the eyes of others. But as soon as the front door closed, she slipped off her heels, hung her coat on the rack, and disappeared into her office without a word. I stood there for a moment in my dress, the faint scent of champagne still on my skin, and felt the weight of the shift. The silence in our apartment was so thick it almost had a texture, and I hated that it felt so familiar. I hated that I knew the pattern so well I could predict it down to the second. The closer the wedding came, the more I began to question what we were building. I still loved her, God, I loved her in a way that made no sense, in a way that survived all the coldness and the distance, but I couldn't ignore the ache of wondering if she loved me in the same way. Did she see me as a partner, or was I just a perfect fit for the image she wanted to project? The thought haunted me late at night, lying beside her in bed while she scrolled through her phone or read documents until her eyes closed. Sometimes I would reach for her hand under the covers, and she would let me hold it for a few seconds before slipping it away, not unkindly, but as if it was an afterthought she couldn't keep. I started looking for signs, tiny proofs that I wasn't imagining the love between us. The way she rested her palm against my back when guiding me through a crowded room. The way she glanced at me during interviews, quick and fleeting, like she was checking to see if I was okay. The way her voice softened on the phone when she said my name, even if the rest of the conversation was clipped and businesslike. I gathered these moments like fragile pieces of glass, careful not to drop them, terrified that if I did, there would be nothing left. One evening, I tried again to bridge the gap. I suggested we skip another social event and spend the night just the two of us. She hesitated, then agreed, and I felt a spark of hope. I made dinner, lit candles, put on soft music. For the first hour, it almost felt like the night I'd been waiting for, She asked me about my day, she laughed at something I said, she even leaned over to kiss my forehead while I was pouring the wine. But slowly, she drifted away again, her eyes drawn back to her phone, her mind already somewhere else. By dessert, we were sitting in silence, and I felt that familiar loneliness settle into my bones. I wanted to tell her then how much I missed her, even when she was sitting right in front of me. I wanted to say that I didn't need the public displays, the glamorous events, the admiration of strangers, I just needed her. But the words caught in my throat, because I knew that saying them out loud might push her further away. So instead, I smiled, cleared the plates, and told myself that maybe after the wedding, after all this pressure was gone, we would finally find our way back to each other. I held on to that hope like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. It happened on a night when the air between us felt heavier than usual, the kind of night where silence wasn't just an absence of sound but a wall closing in. We'd just returned from yet another event, another evening spent smiling for cameras and talking to people who adored the idea of us. I had tried all night to catch her eyes in a way that meant something more than performance, but every glance felt rehearsed, every touch placed exactly where it needed to be for appearances. By the time we got home, the makeup on my face felt like a mask I couldn't wait to take off, and the ache in my chest was louder than any music we'd danced to earlier. She was already walking toward her office when I called her name. My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to, but it was enough to make her stop and turn. The look on her face was unreadable, tired, guarded, waiting for me to say whatever it was so she could move on. I told her we needed to talk, and even as the words left my mouth, I could see her shoulders tense. She stayed standing, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe as if she was ready to retreat the moment this conversation turned into something she didn't want to hear. I started with what I'd been carrying for months, the truth I'd swallowed too many times, that I missed her, even when she was right beside me. That I felt like I was marrying someone who existed for the world but not for me. That I wanted to feel wanted, not just displayed. The words came out shakier than I intended, my throat tight with everything I'd been holding back. She listened without interrupting, but her expression stayed calm in that way that made me wonder if she was hearing me at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost too steady. She said I didn't understand, that this was how she had learned to survive, by keeping her emotions tightly wound, by not giving too much of herself to anyone, because the last time she did, she lost everything. She didn't give details, but I didn't need them. I could see in the way her jaw tightened that it was something deep, something that still left scars she refused to let anyone touch. She said loving me was both the easiest and hardest thing she had ever done. Easy because I had never asked her to be anything other than herself, hard because being herself meant living behind walls she didn't know how to take down. I told her I didn't want her perfect. I didn't care if she stumbled, if she broke, if she let me see the mess she kept hidden from the world. I just wanted her to let me in. For a moment, her eyes softened, and I thought she might step closer. But then she looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the doorframe like she was holding on to it for balance. She admitted she was afraid of loving too much, of losing control, of needing someone so badly that their absence could destroy her. She said she'd spent years building a life where no one could hurt her like that again, and that sometimes she didn't know how to let go of the armor. Even for me, her honesty hit me harder than I expected. It was the first time she had ever spoken about her distance as something more than just habit. And in that moment, I felt two opposite things at once, relief that she was finally telling me the truth, and sadness that love wasn't enough to fix it overnight. I wanted to wrap my arms around her and promise that I wasn't going anywhere, but I also knew that promises couldn't erase fear. The gap between us wasn't about my worth or her feelings, it was about the ghosts she carried, the ones I couldn't banish for her. We stood there for a long time, not touching, just looking at each other like there was too much between us to say in one night. Finally, she stepped closer and rested her hand briefly on my cheek. It wasn't the kind of touch that erased all the hurt, but it was enough to tell me she was trying in her own way. And maybe that was all she could give me right now, not the open, unguarded love I craved, but the effort, the smallest crack in the wall she had built around herself. It wasn't enough to make me feel whole, but it was enough to keep me holding on. Because somewhere deep inside, I still believed that if I stayed, one day she might let the wall fall entirely. And when she did, I wanted to be there to catch her. The morning of the wedding began with sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains, a soft golden glow touching everything in the room, yet none of it touched the cold knot twisting inside my stomach. The city outside was already alive, traffic humming, church bells echoing faintly, and somewhere in the distance, the muffled cheers of people preparing to celebrate us. I sat at the vanity while the stylist worked on my hair, the sound of pins clicking into place blending with the chatter of assistants rushing in and out. They spoke about flowers arriving on time, about the press lining up along the street, about how perfect everything was turning out. I smiled when someone looked at me, nodded when they asked if I was excited, but inside I felt an uneasy stillness, like standing in the eye of a storm. The woman I was marrying was somewhere else in the hotel, probably surrounded by her own small army of helpers. I wanted to see her before the ceremony, just to feel like this was real between us and not another performance. But the schedule kept us apart, and maybe that was easier for her. For me, it only deepened the ache when I finally stepped into the gown. The room seemed to hold its breath. Cameras clicked, people gasped softly, someone said I looked like I belonged on the cover of a magazine. I should have felt beautiful, I should have felt like a bride. But all I felt was a strange disconnect, like I was dressing for a role instead of stepping into the most intimate promise of my life. My mother's voice trembled when she told me how proud she was. She didn't know the doubts that had kept me awake so many nights. She didn't see the quiet distance between us, the invisible wall that had survived even our most tender moments. Everyone believed they were about to witness a love story. Only I knew how much of it lived in shadows. The ceremony was breathtaking. The aisle was lined with white roses, the air fragrant and sweet, and the soft music made the whole scene feel like it had been painted. When she appeared at the end of the aisle, my chest tightened. She was stunning, every line of her dress, every step she took, every calm, confident glance she cast toward me. The crowd was silent, their admiration almost tangible. And for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, here in front of everyone, she was walking toward me not just as my bride but as the woman who would finally let me in. She smiled as she reached me, the kind of smile that photographs well, and when she took my hands, they were cool and steady. The vows passed in a blur. We repeated the words, exchanged rings, kissed under the weight of applause. People cheered, someone shouted our names, cameras flashed like bursts of lightning. Her arm slipped around my waist as we walked back down the aisle together, the perfect couple in the perfect moment. Every face we passed was beaming. I wondered if anyone noticed the slight stiffness in her hold, the way her hand didn't quite grip mine as tightly as mine gripped hers. The reception unfolded like a dream, long tables glittering with candles, champagne flowing, laughter spilling across the room. We danced, posed for pictures, clinked glasses to the sound of people toasting to our forever. She was flawless in every interaction, her charm making her the star of the night. Whenever her eyes met mine, it was with that same polished warmth she gave to everyone else. And yet, when no one was looking, her gaze would drift away, her body angled just slightly so there was always a little space between us. I laughed when I was supposed to, leaned in when the cameras turned, but every moment felt like a performance we both knew the script to. Later, when the music softened and most of the guests were on the dance floor, she took my hand and led me out to the terrace. The night air was cool, the city lights stretching endlessly around us. For the first time that day, there were no cameras, no audience, just the two of us. I waited for her to speak, to say something real, something only meant for me. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching, and for a heartbeat I thought this was it, the moment she would finally let me see all of her. But instead, she reached for my hand, pressed a soft kiss against it, and whispered, "We should go back inside." Her voice was gentle, but it carried the same guarded tone I'd known since the day I fell in love with her. We returned to the party, back into the bright lights and familiar roles. Everyone would remember this as the happiest night of our lives, and in photographs, it would look exactly that way. But as I stood beside her, smiling for the 100th picture, I couldn't help but wonder if I had just married the love of my life, or the version of her she allowed the world to see. And deep down, I feared the answer. The hotel suite was quiet after the reception, almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The faint hum of the city drifted through the balcony doors, but inside, the air felt heavy and still. I slipped off my shoes and set them carefully by the couch, my gown pooling around me like a weight I couldn't shake. She was already across the room, unpinning her hair in front of the mirror, her back to me. The sequins of her dress caught the soft lamplight, glittering in a way that made her look untouchable, like she belonged to some other world. I stood there for a long moment, just watching her, trying to decide if I should break the silence or wait for her to. In the movies, this would be the part where the tension melted into passion, where the distance closed and the vows we'd just exchanged became more than words. But we weren't in a movie, and the reality between us was colder. I walked toward her slowly, my fingers brushing the smooth fabric of her dress. She met my gaze in the mirror, her expression unreadable. I told her she looked beautiful, and she gave me a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. I reached up to help remove the last few pins from her hair, and for a moment, my fingers touched her skin. It should have been electric, but instead it felt tentative, like we were strangers testing the edges of familiarity. She thanked me quietly and stepped away, moving toward the balcony. The night air rushed in as she opened the door, carrying the scent of the city, smoke, flowers, and something faintly metallic. She leaned against the railing, looking out over the skyline. I joined her, standing close enough that our shoulders touched. The view was breathtaking, lights glittering like scattered stars, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional sound of laughter from the streets below. I told her the city seemed like it was still celebrating, even without us there. She nodded but didn't look at me. After a long silence, I asked her the question I'd been holding in all night, "Are you happy?" She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then she said she was happy for the life we had built, for the stability and the success and the way we looked together. But love was complicated for her. She said it like it was an apology, but also like it was a fact she couldn't change. She turned to face me then, her expression softer than it had been all night. She said she wanted to love me the way I deserved, but she didn't know how to be that open without feeling like she was risking everything. She'd built her life on control, over her career, her image, her emotions, and letting go of that control terrified her. I told her I didn't need her to be perfect. I just needed her to try. I told her I could live without the grand gestures and the constant closeness if I could just feel her heart sometimes, if I could know that when we were alone, I wasn't just another part of the image she projected to the world. She looked at me for a long moment, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out and took my hand. Her grip was firm, warm, and this time she didn't let go. We stood there like that, holding on to each other, with the city sprawling beneath us. In that silence, there was something unspoken but real, a promise, maybe not the kind we had exchanged in front of everyone, but one that mattered more. It wasn't a promise to love without fear, or to give me every part of herself. It was a promise to try, to take one step closer, even if she stumbled. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need her to be everything at once. I just needed her to meet me halfway, again and again, until the space between us was small enough to cross without hesitation. When we finally went back inside, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The distance wasn't gone, but it felt different now, less like a wall, more like a bridge we were both learning how to build. And maybe that was enough for tonight. Maybe that was enough to start. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves emotional romance, and subscribe for more heartfelt LGBTQ love stories. Your support means the world, and it helps me bring more real, raw, and inspiring tales to life. Let's keep telling stories that matter.